Hi there, I am Felipe Bartolo Alegre. I am a Bachelor of Social Science with a mention in Cultural Anthropology from the National University of San Marcos, which is located in Lima, Peru. After finishing my undergraduate studies, though, I decided to pursue a Master of Philosophy with a mention in Epistemology, also in San Marcos. In this way, I involved myself with topics such as philosophy of language, ethics, argumentation theory, formal and philosophical logic, and especially the fields of theory of science and logic of science. My current research deals with the logical status of inconsistent science. In my master thesis, for example, I proved the logical possibility of testing inconsistent empirical theories, which led me, by the way, to critically revise Karl Popper's falsificationism, extending its scope. My dissertation was not so much of a defense of inconsistent theories, but a proposal for studying their empirical content, or the lack thereof in some cases. I am also the current president of the Peruvian Society for Epistemology and Logic, a very young society that aims to promote and disseminate research on philosophy, logic, science, and the intersections between these disciplines. Although I did my undergraduate in social science, I regard myself more as a philosopher of science and logic, and I want to contribute to these fields in the years to come. My next project is to develop a formal framework for empirical testing that can be useful in all, or at least in most, logical contexts. That is, a framework that works both if we are using a classical logic or a non-classical one. So, the topic of this video is precisely non-classical logics. How can we define them? I think the best way to start is by defining classical logic first, and defining non-classical logic by opposition. For this, I find very useful a definition proposed by Peruvian philosopher Francisco Miro Quesada Cantuarias in his paper Heterodox Logic and the Problem of the Unity of Logic, which is linked in the description. There he defines classical logic as a system with three distinctive traits. First, it has a formal language like those that are characteristic of modern logic. That is propositional logic, for example, first-order logic, and even modal logic. Second, this language must be assertoric, which means that the formulae of sentences of this language must stand for assertions or propositions, and not so much for questions or imperatives or sentences of other kinds. Finally, this logical system must satisfy some logical principles that are considered classical, notably the principle of excluded third, the principle of non-contradiction, and the principle of identity. Any logic that lacks any of these traits is said to be heterodox, deviant, or, in our case, non-classical. Now, most non-classical logics are so because they do not satisfy some of the logical principles of classical logic. So let's delve a bit more into these principles. The principle of excluded third, also known as the principle of excluded middle or tertium non datur, states that a proposition must have one of the two classical logical values, true or false. Hence, there can be no third logical value apart from those, nor a middle logical value between them, like, for example, uncertain. Now, it may be tempting to say that a sentence like "it will rain tomorrow" is neither true nor false, or it may be uncertain whether this will be the case. However, a classical logician may reply that such a proposition already is true or false, but just we don't know if it is true or false. Perhaps we never will, but objectively it is already true or false. In any case, a logic that doesn't satisfy this principle is often called paracomplete, as Miro Quesada himself suggested, by the way, since in principle it would not be able to establish the truth or falsity of all of its sentences. Some of them would be neither true nor false. Now, the excluded third says that a proposition needs to be true or false. However, could a sentence be both true and false? Furthermore, can a sentence like Ana is Mexican and its negation, which would be Ana is not Mexican, be both true? Well, this is forbidden by the principle of non-contradiction, according to which a sentence and its negation cannot be both true at the same time and with respect to the same thing. This normally implies that no sentence can be both true and false again at the same time and with respect to the same thing. Now, this specification, at the same time and with respect to the same thing, is crucial here. The sentence, "A comet will hit the planet this Christmas," may be false if we utter it this year, and the planet refers to Mars. But false if we utter it next year and the planet is Earth. This way of being both true and false is not forbidden by the principle of non-contradiction. What this principle forbids instead is that an accurate sentence like "A comet will hit Mars on December 25, 2022, and its negation be both true, or that that sentence be at the same time true and false. The principle of non-contradiction is very closely related to another one, which is called the principle of explosion, or ex contradictione sequitur quod licet, which is Latin for "from a contradiction or from contradictions follows anything you want." According to this principle, anything logically follows from a contradiction, i.e., from a sentence and its negation. Hence, from premises like Ana is Mexican and Ana is not Mexican, we may conclude that there is intelligent life in Jupiter. Now, the fact that the conclusion is totally unrelated to the premises doesn't matter, for this principle clearly states that absolutely anything follows from a contradiction. By the way, something similar happens in the joke, "If you're a better singer than Freddie Mercury, then I am the Queen of England." In this case, we assert at any sentence we want, conditionally on a seemingly absurd assertion. Now, a logic that doesn't satisfy the principle of contradiction or the principle of explosion is often called paraconsistent, as Miro Quesada famously suggested in a letter that I will link in the description. By the way, also, relevant logic is a special branch of paraconsistent logic where a valid inference exists only if the premises are relevant to the conclusion. In this way, the principle of explosion could not be used for inferring that there is intelligent life in Jupiter, from the contradiction that Ana is and is not French. Well, finally, the principle of identity states that any object of a given domain is always identical to itself, which seems to be trivially true. But you can think about it in this way. If 2 plus 1 equals 3, and 3 equals 1 plus 2, then 2 plus 1 should also equal 1 plus 2. Hence, 2 plus 1, 3, and 1 plus 2 would be all one and the same object. I say all between quote marks because, well, it doesn't seem to be sensible to say that, to refer to them as if they were distinct objects, as if they were members of a set with more than one object. In any case, some authors, like the great physicist Erwin Schrödinger, have suggested that this principle fails for the ultimate constituents of matter. We'll see a bit more about that later. A logic that doesn't satisfy the principle of identity is called a non-reflexive logic, after the suggestion of Brazilian philosopher Décio Krauss. Now, this list of classical logical principles can be extended. For example, we may add the principles of transitivity, cut, and monotony or monotonicity. The latter principle roughly states that if a sentence P follows from a set of sentences A, then it also should follow from any set B such that A is a subset of B. Some may argue that the principle of monotony fails in contexts like legal reasoning and inductive reasoning, where adding more information might make us retract from the conclusion we arrived from our previous and most limited set of information. For example, if we were to observe 100 swans and all of these swans were white, we may inductively reach to the conclusion that it is highly probable that all swans are white. However, if we add just one more premise to that information, one more observation, an observation stating that another swan is of a color different white, for example black, that would be enough for us to retract from the conclusion that it is highly probable that all swans are white, because we already know that at least one swan is not white, it's black indeed. So it is no longer possible to think that this is a highly probable statement. In any case though, whatever our definition of classical logic is, it most likely includes the traits and logical principles previously mentioned. On the other hand, it's worth remarking that there is no unique classical logic, since there are many ways in which we can deviate from classical logic. For example, several systems of paraconsistent logic have been devised in the last 80 years or so, in fact, infinitely many. By the way, some even argue that there is also more than one classical logic, but that's a topic for another talk. Now let's delve a bit more into where non-classical logics can be used. I have chosen two domains of application that are very closely related: the theory of science, which is my main area of research, and the theory of reason or rationality. Let's see the theory of science first. Logic is a key tool for the theory of science. Without logic, it would be very difficult to systematically study how a given theory or hypothesis stands with respect to reality. After all, testing a theory involves logically deducing, with the help of some background hypothesis, which directly testable statements about observable states of affairs would give support to that theory or hypothesis, and which ones would not give support to that theory or hypothesis. On the other hand, most philosophers in science expect that the scientific knowledge has some logical properties, particularly that of consistency or not implying two mutually contradictory statements. However, it is a fact that inconsistencies arise in scientific knowledge and with some frequency. For example, some early formulations of several respective theories that made sense in their time were inconsistent. This includes Frege's theory, early quantum mechanics, and perhaps early Newtonian physics. Some philosophers like Jesus Mosterin defend that for all the inconsistencies that our scientific knowledge may have, they are not to be taken as germane to it, but as temporary flaws to overcome. I agree with this view, but I think that if we are to make reason or to try and study the logical properties of an inconsistent theory, provided we grant them logical properties, a way to do it would require the use of non-classical logics, more exactly, paraconsistent logics. This could also have a more practical benefit, since if we discovered that some important current theory was inconsistent, we were not able to immediately find a consistent substitute for it, we may, in the meanwhile, keep using that same theory with the help of a paraconsistent logic. How? Well, that's precisely the topic of my master dissertation, which is linked in the description. If you want to know more about inconsistency and science, I recommend you look at the entries on inconsistent mathematics of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. For the case of empirical science, I recommend you check the third chapter of my dissertation or my working paper, Inconsistency in Empirical Sciences. All of these articles will be linked in the description. Before ending this section, it's worth mentioning that non-classical logics other than paraconsistent ones have been proposed to be applied in science. For example, there is Hans Reichenbach's proposal to use a three-valued paracomplete logic as the underlying logic of quantum mechanics, and also Deschaux-Krause's use of a non-reflexive logic for modeling the behavior of elementary particles, the ultimate constituents of matter, as Schrödinger said. But the list doesn't end there, of course. The other field of application I wanted to mention is that of the theory of reason or rationality. I will use those terms equivalently in this video. This field is very much related to the theory of science, since we often say that scientific knowledge must be rational. Science must be rational in general. However, it has been argued, at least from Aristotle, that a necessary condition for regarding any belief system as rational is that it bears no contradictions. But if we accept that scientific knowledge is inconsistent, does this mean that it is irrational to believe in scientific knowledge? Well, one way to address this issue involves the use of non-classical logics. If the underlying logic of science is not classical logic but a paraconsistent one, then our scientific knowledge would no longer need to be consistent in order for us to rationally believe in it. Hence, a non-classical logic would be the logic of scientific reasoning, although there is no agreement among non-classical logicians as to which one would or should be. Now, there are ways to address this issue that do not require paraconsistent logics, like the one proposed by Peter Vickers in his book Understanding Inconsistent Science. But even if we accept Vickers' proposal, non-classical logics can also be used for studying rationality as it appears outside of the scientific realm. For instance, the very little explored research field called ethnologic deals with how conventions on argumentation, reasoning, and the very logical principles may vary across cultures. An interesting contribution in this line are the studies by Bolivian professor Iván Guzmán de Rojas about the underlying logic of the Aymara language. According to him, Aymara logic would not be classical but a paracomplete logic that includes a third logical value for expressing what is perhaps true and perhaps false, something like the indeterminate value. Also related to this is Graham Priest's study of early Buddhism doctrine of Catus Coti, whose underlying logic would be both paraconsistent and paracomplete one, a four-valued logic including the logical values true, false, both true and false, and neither true nor false. It is worth mentioning here the studies by Brazilian professors Evandro Gomes and Itala de Ottaviano on the prehistory of paraconsistent logic, tracing its roots to Greek and medieval philosophy. This somehow shows that the issue of logic's alternative to classical logic and of rationality's alternative to the rationality presupposed by classical logic are not only to be found in non-Western intellectual traditions and cultures, but also at the very roots of Western intellectual history. Something else worth remarking here is that non-classical logic have a deep significance for the very problem of the nature of rationality. In this respect, Miro Quesada himself poses the question of whether the multiplicity of non-classical logics endangers the very existence of reason, understood as the faculty by which we can think logically. Consider it this way. If there are several and often mutually incompatible conceptions of logic, then it means that there are several ways to be logical, and hence that there is more than one reason or rationality. But if this was the case, Miro Quesada says that reason may be arbitrary or relative, which would be very much against what he expects it to be. The problem then becomes whether there are some traits that are common to all proper conceptions of logic, and that can let us assert some unity of logic and reason or rationality, or if instead we have to accept that logic and reason are a bit arbitrary or relative. This is an open question about which I hope more research is done in the future. If you want to delve more into the world of non-classical logics, you can find several recommendations in the description. This includes writings by important scholars in the field such as Susan Hack, Graham Priest, Newton da Costa, Aida Ruda, Gladys Palau, and Francisco Miro Quesada, among others. Also, if you want to know more about the Peruvian Society for Epistemology and Logic, please check out our website spell.org.pe and our Facebook page spell.org.pe, where we post all of our events and activities. Well, thanks for your attention, and I hope this was as fun for you as it was for me.